Hi, my name is Oscar Chacon, and as I said earlier, I happen to work as executive director of something called National Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean Communities. And the question of civic engagement, is central, to the life of particularly Latino immigrant communities in the U.S. And one comment I wanted to make is that I think that the great challenge we have, and the more I think about it, I am convinced that it is not just a challenge in relationship to immigrant communities, but it's a challenge in face of society as a whole, and it is how do we make civic engagement become truly inspirational and truly accessible, to people. Because when we only talk about civic engagement in the context of elections, it's almost like looking at a piano keyboard and hitting one key only and pretending that people will be excited about the tune that comes out. We think that civic engagement, and for that matter, building democracy, is really a harmony. And the harmony requires that you play multiple keys. And so the challenge then is, how do we make it be so? I also wanted to mention that we feel very strongly that there is a growing sense of powerlessness, in society. Of course, affecting immigrant communities, but across the board. And we feel that powerlessness, in absence of truly inspirational options that are actionable, inevitably lead for people to feeling disengaged and indifferent, which is what we see very often at the national level. And the last comment I would make is that, especially given the fact that I, like several other people in this room here, have been working very hard the last 12 years or so to try to produce immigration policy reform, in the US, only to see our hopes become extremely high and then come down to the floor because we end up empty-handed. And so in this respect, we also feel that there is something happening at the local level, something happening, at municipal levels, at a state level, where we are beginning to be able to articulate more people-centered agendas that are more inspirational and that are actually producing results. So this is the question that I actually had for you three. The question is, how do you see local, state level power building processes as potential hopes and trendsetters, for what may happen nationally in what I believe we would all agree an ever more dysfunctional federal government?
That's a great question. And could you guys, in answering, touch on that broadening conception, that idea of thinking about engagement as something more than just voting as a range of practices?
Yeah, just going back to, Oscar, to your original question, that's totally and completely right. Sometimes I phrase it as, what does democracy look like the other 364 days of the year? And there's no question, I like Sayu's terminology, which is that there is a continuum of engagement. I see Martha McCoy in the audience, who runs Everyday Democracy, and sort of the idea of engaging citizens in small groups, ideally with encouragement from local cities and communities and states to do that, so that there's a real process. You go back to the old, at one time having public hearings on legislation was a great breakthrough. Now they've sort of faded that way. But I think the idea of providing mechanisms where people can be part of the discussion and the conversation about planning, and one of the speakers this morning talked about how Detroit has had that, is one set of things. Two, there's no question that organizing for power is critical. That is, taking the conversation and taking the engagement and the community and saying we want to make changes, and holding elected officials accountable, et cetera. But I would say that if you exclude, it's also important to be part of that process, to take control of that process, not to sort of say, well, it's so corrupt, it's so money-driven, it's so this, it's so that we can't be part of it. You end up fighting with one hand tied behind your back. So I think the continuum is day-to-day civic engagement, real organizing for power, whether it's in the workplace, like the fast food workers and are doing, and then being involved in electoral politics. And then the last piece is, once people are elected, and again, I liked Sayu's formulation because it was both giving them, and I say this as a former elected official, both giving them the support and encouragement and sense of still belonging to a community, and at the same time holding their feet to the fire when they start to sort of get too comfortable in the process. And I think that it's possible. You know, it's walking, chewing gum, and drinking our non-sweetened beverages all at the same time. But I think we can do it, and what's more, I think we have to do it, because otherwise we're not going to make the change. We've got to go on all of those levels, including trying to change the narrative.
Yeah. So I like the question, and let me modify it a bit. I mean, I like state, I like local, I like federal, but let's include tribal, because I think that there's some wonderful things happening at the tribal level. It has huge implications and possible impact that we don't treat tribes as the sovereign nations that they are, and the impacts that they can have on civic engagement. I think the other part, and this is where we feel very strongly from our approach at First Nations, is that wealth and income matter. And so we do a lot of work investing in the for-profit and the not-for-profit sector in reservation economies. And what we see by doing so, especially as we're building out the not-for-profit sector that really is about 20 years old in reservation economies, maybe a little bit older, but it's very, very much in its infancy, is that the type of people who are coming to work for these not-for-profits, your professionals, your counselors, your lawyers, your doctors, these are people who are bringing their families, either bringing their families back to the res or returning to the res to raise their family, and they are very much engaged in the political and civil discourse at the school board level, at the tribal council level, and so I think that by building that economy, you're bringing back that civil discourse to the reservation economy itself.